There are highs and lows in friendships, just like there are in marriages. People who are closest to you are the ones with whom you share your life, including your joys and even your troubles. On the other hand, there are occasions when such relationships might become hazy, and you may breach boundaries that you never imagined you would. At no point in my life did I ever expect that I would find myself in a circumstance that would force me to question all I knew about love, friendship, and loyalty. Then, however, it took place. Because everything occurred so gradually, I did not even become aware that the boundary had been crossed until I was standing on the opposite side. That would be me, Claire. Mike and I have been married for more than a decade, and I am 36 years old. I am a mother of 2 children. For the most part, it seemed as though our marriage was in a stable state from the outside viewpoint. Our lives are pleasant, if not predictable, because we live in a suburban home, we have a routine with our children, and we have a routine. When Mike and I initially started dating, we had a lot of enthusiasm for each other, but that has since diminished. There are times when it seems more like we are just partners in life management than we are lovers. While I was aware that this was not an uncommon occurrence in long-term relationships, I couldn't help but desire the spark that we had in the past. Then there is Emma, who is my closest buddy. In my memory, we have been friends for as long as I can remember. She tied the knot with Greg, a man who appeared to be the ideal match for her characteristics. He was successful, charming, and a caring father. Everyone looked up to Emma and Greg as a couple since they were usually smiling and looking put together when they attended social events. On the other hand, things were not as excellent as they appeared to be behind closed doors. As is typical for situations like these, the story began in a somewhat harmless manner. Throughout his life, Greg has always been a pleasant, easygoing, and sociable companion. If I ever desired to get rid of Mike, Emma would frequently joke that Greg had a best friend who would be ideal for me to become his partner. The playful banter took on a different tone as time went on, even though it was always expressed in fun about the situation. The beginning of everything took place on a Friday evening. The invitation to eat dinner at their home was extended to Mike and me by Emma. While we were chatting and sharing a bottle of wine among the 4 of us, our children were playing upstairs. The evening proceeded in the same manner as always, with laughter, rehashing old stories, and catching up on life activities. At a certain point, Mike and Emma walked into the kitchen to get more drinks, leaving Greg and me on the patio by ourselves. I could feel Greg's eyes on me, even though we were sitting in a comfortable silence between ourselves. "Are you and Mike still getting along so well?" Even though he was speaking in a low voice, there was a trace of interest in his tone of voice. I shrugged out of an attempt to appear indifferent. "We're doing well. After several years of marriage, you are aware of how things are. Everything comes to a halt." While his eyes locked with mine, Greg gave a slight nod. "Emma and I are the same, that's for sure. It's comfy, but there are moments when it's too comfortable." That was the very first time that Greg had ever suggested that his marriage was not as healthy as it appeared to be. Since I was at a loss for words, I settled for a smile that was only somewhat genuine. "I guess that's just the way things work out." The voice of Greg was lowered as he leaned in slightly closer. "Are you ever longing for it? The thrill of it all?" After being taken aback by his inquiry, I blinked. It caused my heart to skip a beat. Was Greg trying to make a move on me? When I felt a sudden surge of heat crawl up my neck, I shook it off and continued with my day. "There are times," I said, putting myself in a state of surprise with the sincerity of my remarks. "However, life is hectic. Keeping the house running, taking care of the children, and working. There is not much space for excitement in this situation." The way that Greg looked at me seemed to soften his gaze, and for a brief period, I was able to sense a connection developing between us, which was something that I had not anticipated. There was a tangible sense of tension in the air. It was before either of us could say anything else that Mike and Emma came back with drinks, and the moment had already passed. On the other hand, I was unable to shake the impression that Greg and I had changed our relationship. Over the subsequent several weeks, I made an effort to dismiss the experience as nothing more than a fleeting situation. However, Greg and I started to see each other more frequently, attending playdates, meals, and other family gatherings together. I was able to sense the tension rising with each passing moment while we were in the same room together. The duration of our chats increased, the eye contact remained, and how he stared at me caused me to question everything they said. I received a phone call from Emma in the afternoon, asking whether I could pick up her children from school. She had an overwhelming amount of work to do, and Greg was unable to leave a meeting. As I had done a great number of times in the past, I consented, and I brought their children back to my apartment so that they could play with mine. While I was finishing up some work in the kitchen, the children were playing in the living room when Greg arrived to pick them up. I was also in the process of completing some tasks. While leaning against the kitchen counter, Greg acknowledged Claire's assistance and thanked her for her assistance. "You ended up being our savior today." I looked up from my laptop with a grin on my face. Not a single issue at all. The children enjoy playing with one another. Because Greg was looking at me with his eyes fixed on mine, there was a brief pause in the conversation. The tone of his voice was low as he declared, "You and Emma have been friends for a very long time. It's a blessing that she found you." There was something about the way he spoke, a gentleness that caused my stomach to begin to cramp. I was able to sense the weight of his gaze, as well as the words that were not spoken that lingered in the air between us. While I was at a loss for words, I started by saying, "Greg." On the other hand, before I could finish, he moved closer to me. While his eyes were fixed on mine, he whispered, "Claire, I've been thinking about you more than anything else. It's wrong, yet I can't stop myself from doing it. My feelings haven't been this way in a very long time." When his words finally sank in, I felt my heart pounding in my chest. In an attempt to convey to him that we were unable to proceed in this manner, I opened my lips to speak, but the words refused to come out. On the contrary, I remained motionless when he extended his hand and lightly stroked my hand during the exchange. Greg's words were barely audible above a whisper as he took another step forward, bringing the distance between us closer together. "Claire, in his voice, when I should have been pulling away. It would have been better if I had instructed him to stop. On the other hand, I did not. In its place, I let him kiss me. Everything was different after that kiss. At that same instant, I was aware that we had crossed a line that we would never be able to reverse. The line would have repercussions for all of those concerned, including Mike, Emma, and our families. Nevertheless, while I stood there in Greg's arms, I didn't care about anything. It was at that very time when the only thing that mattered was the fact that I wanted him and he wanted me. The truth of what we had done came crashing down around us when we finally reached the point where we could draw away. I was able to see the shame that Greg was feeling in his eyes, the same guilt that I was feeling in my stomach. "We shouldn't have done that," I said, my voice shaking slightly as I spoke softly. "It's not right in any way." Greg gave a slight nod, his face displaying pain. "It is true, but I am unable to control how I am feeling, Claire. Since I was a young girl, I've been attracted to you." Taking a few steps back, I was able to create some distance between us. "Greg, we are unable to accomplish this. We are unable to." Having said those words, however, I was aware that it was not yet finished. It was impossible to deny the force that was exerting itself between us. It continued to get stronger over the subsequent few weeks. Eventually, we gave in to the temptation and started contacting each other and finding excuses to meet each other. We eventually caved into the temptation. The affair was initiated by us. The affair continued for several months, remaining unseen in the background of our lives. Whenever Mike was away, we would meet in private, whether it was at hotels, in Greg's car, or even at my address. Every time we were in the same room, it felt as though we were walking on a knife's edge, aware that a single mistake could reveal everything that we had been keeping hidden. Nevertheless, the concealment served to ratchet up the enthusiasm. Everything about it made me feel alive in a way that I hadn't experienced in years, including the excitement of sneaking around, the stolen moments, and the forbidden kisses. Greg gave me the impression that I was desired and wanted, and during those times, I didn't want to worry about the consequences. I didn't give a damn about the danger. I was addicted to the rush that came from being in his presence. The weight of our lives, however, gradually began to catch up with us before we realized it. Being unable to ignore the guilt became increasingly difficult, and the stress of concealing the affair began to take its toll on the individual. It was clear to me that Mike was becoming increasingly distant from me, and I was aware that he had a feeling that something was wrong. But I never told him, and he never inquired about it. When I returned home one evening, I discovered Mike sitting at the kitchen table with a gloomy expression on his face. This was after yet another secret rendezvous session with Greg. At that very instant, I was aware that he had worked out the solution. It was with a voice that was choked up with emotion that he said, "Claire, we need to talk." As soon as I sat down opposite him, my heart began to rush. "What exactly is going on?" While attempting to maintain a steady tone, I inquired. An expression of hurt and betrayal could be seen in Mike's eyes as he stared at me. "About you and Greg. I am aware of it." I felt the blood drain from my face as the words struck me like a punch to the gut, and I thought I was going to die. The phrase, His voice was quivering with rage as he interrupted, saying, "I don't want to hear excuses. Simply said, I am curious as to why. Why did you choose to act in this manner?" Amid my attempt to find the appropriate words, tears began to rise in my eyes. I hushed, "I'm not sure," as I waited. "It was not my intention for it to take place, Mike. I never intended to cause you any harm." After staring at me for a considerable amount of time, Mike finally shook his head. "There is no longer any time for that, Claire. You have already caused me pain." My thoughts kept going back to Mike's statements. Deeply, I had caused him pain. I felt the weight of my deeds crushing me, and there was no way to repair what had been done after it had been done. My husband, who was also the father of my children, had been betrayed by me, and there was no way to sugarcoat the situation. There was a thick stillness between us, one that was heavy with the words that were not spoken as they hung in the air. I was aware that I needed to explain, but I was at a loss for words. What would be the best way for me to convey something that I did not fully comprehend? The words, "I never wanted to hurt you, Mike," were repeated in a low whisper, and my voice was shaking. "However, things between us haven't been the same for a very long time," stated the speaker. Although Mike's demeanor mildly softened, the agony that was seen in his eyes did not go away. "Claire, you had the opportunity to speak with me. Having worked through it jointly would have been possible. Rather than that, you went to Greg, who is my closest friend. Are you even remotely aware of how much pain that causes?" I was overcome with shame as I nodded my head as tears began to fall down my cheeks. I know that it was wrong. I am completely clueless as to why it took place, Mike. It did. Mike gave a vigorous shake of his head before rising from the table and walking around the kitchen. "Claire, that is not an acceptable response. It simply took place, right? That is not an acceptable explanation. A decision was made by you, and that decision was to betray me and destroy our marriage." I was able to just make out my voice as I mumbled, "I know. I am sorry for my error. It was a terrible error." Even for a brief period, Mike remained silent. Simply standing there with his back turned to me and his shoulders tight, he did not move. I wanted to reach out to him and offer him some solace, but I was aware that there was nothing I could do to make this situation any better. "What are our next steps?" I eventually inquired, having a trembling voice. It was impossible to discern Mike's expression as he turned to face me. "I don't know," he whispered in a low voice. "I require some time to reflect." As soon as he finished speaking, he exited the kitchen, leaving me to think over my views on my own. Following that, I experienced some of the most difficult days of my whole life. Mike didn't talk to me very often, and when he did, it was only about the children or topics that were related to logistics. I couldn't help but feel sorry for him because it was obvious that he was having a hard time processing what had occurred. Even I was having a hard time. The trust that we had in our marriage had been shattered by me, and I was unsure whether or not it could ever be restored. Regarding Greg, we completely ceased all conversation with one another. I ignored him even though he had called and texted me several times. I am unable to confront him. The feeling of guilt was too great, and I was aware that carrying on with the affair would only make the situation even more difficult. This was the end. It had to come to an end. However, even though I had completed my relationship with Greg, the harm had already been done. Because Mike was aware of the reality, our marriage was in a precarious state. The man I loved had been betrayed by me, and I was unsure whether or not there was any way to repair the damage that I had done. At long last, we sat down to have a conversation one evening, approximately 1 week after Mike had challenged me. It was peaceful in the house because the children had gone to bed. I was able to sense the tension that was there in the atmosphere as we sat opposite one another, and the silence that had been present for what seemed like an eternity continued. When Mike first addressed Claire, he spoke in a low voice and said, "I've been thinking a lot about what happened about us. Additionally, I need to know whether or not you still want to be with me. You still adore me, don't you?" It hit me like a ton of bricks when he asked me questions. Without a doubt, I continued to love him. On the other hand, love by itself was not sufficient to repair the damage that had been done. The rapid beating of my heart in my chest caused me to pause for a brief while. "Yes, Mike," I responded, my voice trembling slightly. "You are my love. Love for you has never ceased to exist." Mike let out a sigh as he began to run his hand through his hair. "I am completely perplexed as to how we arrived at this point, Claire. A team was intended to be formed out of us. Together, we were going to face everything that came our way. And, at this point, I'm not sure if we'll be able to recover from this." When I glanced at him, tears began to well up in my eyes. I responded with a voice that was hardly audible above a whisper. "I don't know either. However, I would like to give it a shot. My goal is to make this right, Mike. At this point, I am prepared to do whatever it takes." Mike's countenance was unreadable as he stared at me for a considerable amount of time. "I'm not sure if I'll be able to forgive you this time, Claire. I am not sure whether I will ever be able to fully trust you again." My heart broke all over again as the weight of his words struck me like a blow to the belly, and I felt my heart breaking all over again. The words, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness," came out of my mouth with a shaking voice. "Nevertheless, I am requesting that you give me a chance. A brief opportunity to put things in order." Michael was silent for a considerable amount of time. For a moment, he did nothing except sit there, his hands locked into fists, staring at the ground. At long last, he made his voice heard. With a low voice, he whispered, "I'm willing to try. On the other hand, it will take some time, Claire. Much of one's time." I was overcome with a sense of relief, and I bowed my head while tears streamed down my face. I hushed with a whisper, "I understand." "I'll wait for as long as it does," she said. Over the subsequent weeks, Mike and I focused our efforts on re-establishing our friendship. Getting through it was not simple, and there were times when it seemed as though we were not making any headway at all. Nevertheless, we gradually started to communicate with one another more openly, to be more truthful with one another regarding our emotions and our requirements. We decided to begin attending couples therapy, and even though the sessions were challenging, they were also beneficial. In the beginning, Mike was not very close to me, and I was aware that it would take some time for him to trust me again. However, I was determined to do whatever I needed to make amends for the harm that I had unintentionally inflicted. Even though I was aware that our marriage would never be the same again, I was resolute in my goal to make it even more robust than it had been in the past. As for Greg and Emma, they, too, gradually became aware of the affair that had developed between them. Their marriage ended up falling apart, and Emma was utterly heartbroken. Because I had contributed to their failure, I was filled with remorse. Nonetheless, I was powerless to alter the course of events. I was only able to concentrate on my connection with Mike and hold out hope that we would eventually be able to mend our wounds. After several months had gone by, Mike and I gradually started to find our way back to each other, even though things were more than anything else. There were still times when uncertainty prevailed, and there were still days when the burden of the past felt like it was too much to carry. However, both of us were making an effort, and that was the most important thing. We were sitting on the balcony one evening when Mike reached out and grabbed my hand. We were watching the sun go down. I was taken aback by the gesture, and I turned my attention to him. He whispered, "We've come a long way," as his thumb lightly brushed over the back of my palm. "We've come a long way." Tears began to well up in my eyes as I nodded. "That is the case." "I'm not saying that everything is fixed," he said, "but I think we're progressing in the right direction." Sluggishly, with a feeling of thankfulness that filled my heart, I gently grasped his hand. I made a hushed thank you sound for allowing us to have a chance. The smile that Mike gave me was a timid one, yet it was so small that it caused my heart to hurt with love for him. My wife, Claire, you are my wife. Moreover, despite everything, I continue to love you. It was a sweet, gentle kiss that felt like the first step toward healing, and it caused tears to fall down my cheeks as I bent over and kissed him. Although it was not the conclusion of our adventure, it was the beginning of a new one. And for the first time in a very long time, I experienced a sense of optimism for the future. After everything was said and done, I realized that love and trust are fragile things that can be easily damaged but are not difficult to repair. The most difficult aspects of oneself must be confronted, which requires time, effort, and a willingness to do so. You can, however, find your way back to the people you love if you are ready to put in the effort. Occasionally, just sometimes, you can find your way back. And that is exactly what Mike and I were doing, slowly but surely making our way back to the place we had been.